Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We're gonna wait 1 more minute to let everyone the time for everyone to join, and we'll get started. Yeah, and just the time for us to have one more drink of water.
Whiskey, obviously.
Yeah, for you, obviously, that's whiskey. Based in Scotland, right?
No, it's herbal tea.
Oh. Well, that would be a funny exercise, right? To run a webinar after a few glasses of whiskey.
I'm not sure who it'd be funny for. Maybe me, I suppose.
All right. So yeah, it's 10 past. Oh, it's 10 past 3. So hi everyone, welcome again to this session. My name is Lauren Pai. I'm the CEO of PacMind. I spent, for those of you who don't know me, I've spent 20 years in the development and quality space, running 3 companies and also scaling the testing business unit at SmartBear. This is where I had the great opportunity and pleasure to work with Seb and the Cucumber team. So for those of you who are not familiar with PacMind, PacMind is an AI-powered platform that enables tech leads to effortlessly accelerate developer skill growth, including BDD, and by sharing and integrating continuously best practices. So basically, this is like capturing the knowledge, expertise of your team, and turning it into action and advice into the IDE of every developer in your team. And at PacMind, we run bi-weekly webinars on dev and tech topics. This one, I'm really excited about this one, not only because I know and appreciate Seb, but because I'm a big fan of BDD. So we're going to talk about BDD from ABC to AI. So also talk about the basics, and there've been a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly BDD is. So we'll have the basics first by Seb. And Seb, I will let you introduce yourself, but one of the comments in LinkedIn when we announced this webinar was, wow, amazing, we'll have a webinar by the master of BDD. So I don't know if it's the right way to introduce you, but yeah. So please introduce yourself, and if you can also share a fun fact about you, that would be amazing.
But you didn't share a fun fact, Laurent.
No, I never do.
That doesn't sound fair.
I'm the host. This is
okay, fair enough. I get the hard questions. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Seb Rose. I have been a software developer since probably 1980. I spent a lot of time working on internet banks and things that are exciting like that. And then in the early 2010s, I moved from being really excited about test-driven development to being really excited about behavior-driven development. I was very lucky to meet Matt Wynn, who was one of the creators of Cucumber for Ruby, and I started working with him and became a co-founder of the Cucumber organization, the company, and we were acquired in 2019 by SmartBear, which is where I met Laurent. So I'm not going to bore you with my journey. If you want to talk to me about history, then raise me up on one of these contact platforms that I've got below. I don't do Twitter very much anymore. Mastodon is not everybody's cup of tea, but you can definitely get me by email. This session is BDD from ABC to AI. So Laurent, obviously PacMind is heavily invested in trying to upskill tech practitioners. AI is flavor of the month. So he asked me, possibly it was a mistake from his point of view, but he asked me to talk about how I thought AI might assist with behavior-driven development. But he also suggested that not everyone on this call would be that familiar with BDD. So the first half, maybe just slightly more than half, is going to be, a crash course in BDD. Maybe not the BDD that you know, but the BDD that is espoused by Cucumber organization and many of the practitioners. And then after that, I will go a little bit deeper and try and point out the areas where I think AI might help and the areas where I don't think it will. So then if I can get this to work, there we go. So let's start off with the initials. What is BDD?
Maybe just before we get to that part, Seb, and in order to better know our audience, I suggest we run a really quick poll. So if you can, just let us know what's your role today. So are you a developer, more in the product side, or QA? Because we'll see BDD is about collaboration between all these, or business analysts or others. So just let us know.
Thank you, Arno.
Yeah, Seb finding the poll. Yeah, that's definitely something we could have added. And for some reason, I don't see I can see now the result of the poll. So we have a majority of developers, Seb, and a few testers and QA, and just one POPM. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that is a fairly typical breakdown, and I'm afraid that's one of the breakdowns of BDD, but we'll talk about that later on. Okay, so behavior-driven development has been around now for possibly 15 years since Dan North first talked about it, and it's changed a lot. When Dan first talked about it, he was talking about trying to teach developers test-driven development, and he was trying to take the test word out of it because he discovered that developers didn't like the word test. BDD is not that anymore. It's not that Dan, people took it away from Dan. The community evolved, and we discovered that one of the biggest problems was there was imperfect communication. Well, there's a surprise, okay? But the imperfect communication between stakeholders, such as product owners, business analysts, customers, and the project team are really troublesome because it leads us to develop things that are not what the customer wanted. And that then leads to unhappy customers, increased product development costs, rework, and all sorts of grief. This particular definition of behavior-driven development comes from the International Institute of Business Analysts Agile extension to the BA body of knowledge. That's what those initials mean at the bottom. And they, unsurprisingly, are focusing on communication between stakeholders and project teams and concrete examples. There's nothing here about automated code. There's nothing here about living documentation. So from the IIBA's perspective, BDD is about making sure that we really understand what it is we're supposed to be developing before we start developing it. And we do that by having high quality communication that documents the outcome of that communication using concrete examples. The Cucumber team define it slightly differently. Unsurprisingly, it's got a little bit more emphasis on automation here. Cucumber we defined it as helping close the gap between business and technical, again, by building a shared understanding. But now the second bullet point really is nodding towards agile. We're working in rapid, small iterations, delivering small increments of functionality. And then finally, automatically checking the documentation is correct. Now, this is about living documentation. This is about taking those concrete examples that we generate while we're generating that we create while we're generating that shared understanding, and then writing them in a format that the business can understand, i.e. documentation, and then automating or writing automation code that allows that documentation to check that the system actually works in the way that is being documented. You'll notice that none of that, even here on the Cucumber site, the test word is not there. So we're all huge fans of testing and very supportive of testers and all QA activities. However, BDD is a collaboration tool, and testing is a nice side effect of working through a BDD process. This is a diagram that Matt Wynn put together, and it's still on the cucumber.io blog site. It shows that the BDD approach is cyclical. You take a user story and you pass the user story sequentially through the mills of discovery, formulation, and automation. And once you go through automation, you've got an increment to your working software. So don't take this diagram as saying you get all your user stories, then you do discovery on all your user stories and formulate all your user stories, then automate them all, and then you'll have working software. The idea is you take a user story and bring it into the BDD pipeline. You go through a process of discovery to get to a shared understanding. And as you see here, we're talking about getting to that shared understanding through collaboration. And there are many ways of collaborating. There's many ways of communicating. We at Cucumber, within the Cucumber community, typically recommend using a technique called example mapping, which I'll be talking about later, which is centered on rules and examples. Once the user story that you're working on at the moment has been through discovery, you will have an exhaustive set of rules and examples that need to be implemented. And you then pass that across, no, don't say pass it across. You then take some members of the team and they will then formulate those examples into business terminology that document the intended behavior of the system. So at this point, we've got a shared understanding and we have a business readable document that describes that shared understanding. If you stop there, you'd have, well, documents. But the nice thing about BDD is that there are then tools which you can use to automate that documentation. They basically read the formulated examples and make calls to your system that you're developing to check that it behaves in the way that's documented. Brilliant stuff. So all very simple. I'm now going to just go one slight layer lower down to expand on each of those three practices: discovery, formulation, and automation. So discovery, it's a topic in its own right. Gaspar and I wrote a book about it a number of years ago. And the purpose of discovery is to really uncover and document the ambiguities, the misunderstandings, the assumptions that people have. Because nothing is as clear as you think it is. And the only way of really finding the bits that are unclear is by exposing your understanding to other people who have got different perspectives. We do this discovery we call it a discovery workshop. Some people call it example mapping sessions, but more commonly in the Agile community, it really falls under the banner of the 3 Amigos meeting. It's not a term that I particularly like, but that's just to give you some sort of base level to work with. And at the 3 Amigos meeting, at the discovery workshop, we work together to generate a shared understanding of the problem. The product owner, business analyst, the business stakeholder comes to that meeting with the story that they would like to start or continue discovery on, and their candidate rules, the candidate business requirements they think should be implemented when that story gets delivered. But at the session, what we're doing is we are refining the scope of those stories based on the new understanding that we generate by exposing the initial requests to the perspectives of the testers and the developers that are involved in the workshop. So the product owner may come with a story and some candidate rules, but at the end of the first discovery workshop, we may end up with 3 stories and lots of new rules and some refined rules. And then we'll probably park 2 of those stories and continue discovery on the most important story that we have uncovered. More on that later. The point is, even discovery itself is iterative. You may go around discovery a number of times while the product owner, business analyst gets to understand quite how complicated or complex what they're asking for, and the development team begin to understand what direction the system is going in. As I said, we recommend that you use example mapping. This is a sample example map with nothing written on the cards. The idea, however, is that at every example mapping session, we're dealing with a single story represented by the yellow card. And so you would typically write at least a shorthand of the story on the yellow card. And then we have blue cards arranged horizontally beneath the yellow card, which represents the rules or business requirements that need to be implemented for this story to be considered developed or delivered rather. Underneath each rule card, there are green cards, which list the concrete examples that illustrate how that rule should behave. Because what we find, and I'm sure you found it yourself, is that business requirements are generally quite high level and abstract, which is great because that makes them concise, but it makes them hard to really pinpoint down to edge cases and special conditions. And so we use the concrete examples to investigate, explore, and document what the precise elements of that abstract rule. And then
I have said, sorry to interrupt, but an interesting example, and I will share my fun fact doing this.
Okay.
I was traveling abroad at the airport. I wanted to, I rent a car. So I went to the desk and said, okay, I rent a car. My name is Pi, PY. And the person started to type the name, click for search and say, well, there is a problem. I need a third letter. I say, yeah, but my name is Pi, just PY. There is no third letter. So I guess in this example, as all the team developers and testers iterate or refine the requirements, that's typically where someone would come up with, hey, what can be the length of what's last name? Could be just 1 letter or maybe 50. What do we do in this case?
That's a really good one, because actually the example that I'm going to show in just a minute plays directly into that space, not using your name, however. So this is a really good way. It may look simplistic to you, and you don't have to use colored cards. We just do use them when we can, but there are many ways of doing it, as I will demonstrate. But it really is a powerful way of getting to not just shared understanding, but a shared understanding that is persistent, that lives beyond the meeting. Because all too often you can have water cooler conversations and have that aha moment, and then you get back to your desk and you've misunderstood something or something's been forgotten, and you have the same conversation the next week. One of the major benefits of example mapping is the red question cards that you'll see there on the right. The observation that Matt made, is that quite often, despite having a business person and a tester and a developer in the example mapping workshop, what you'll find is that someone will write an example and the product owner is not going to be sure if that is how the system is supposed to behave, because so many product owners may be the product owner, but they aren't the people that make the final decision, they aren't the end customer. And so rather than having a lot of people voice their opinion saying, well, I think that feature should work like this, or no, I think it should work like that. If there's no one in the room that can make the decision, rather than having the discussion, we write it down as a question on a question card, allocate an owner to that question, who then has the responsibility to go out and get the answer before the next example mapping session. In the white box, there are some links for more examples of training material and resources to help you if you decide to look into example mapping a bit more. But now I'm going to show a really short, simplistic example mapping session. I will play a number of characters in this. I'm not going to ask anyone else to play any. It's from Shouty, which is a training tool that we created in the Cucumber organization and have used for many years. And all you really need to know is it's a bit like Twitter, and a user can shout out messages, and here it says they need to be between 1 and 140 characters in length. So the product owner comes along to the example mapping session with this shouts have a minimum and maximum length story. I'm only showing one candidate rule here because this is only a very simplistic demonstration. And the candidate rule is that shouts should be at least 1 character long. Seems straightforward, right? So we put these cards on the table, and the developers and the testers think about it. And the first developer writes on a green card, Sean enters an exclamation mark. Sean shouts, Lucy hears an exclamation mark. So basically, what we're saying is that, Sean's going to type something somewhere and then somehow shout this message to the world, and that Lucy, who's listening on the app somewhere else, can hear that message. The product owner looks at it and goes, not a very useful message, but yes, I think that's how the system should behave. That's a good example. So the developer's on a roll and pulls another green card out and writes down, Sean enters nothing. Sean is unable to shout. Lucy hears nothing. The product owner looks at it and said, that seems reasonable to me. Yep, it says it has to have at least 1 character in it. So we're all good. Tester then crops in and says, well, what if Sean just enters a space and then shouts that? Will Lucy hear a space? Product owner thinks to themselves, goes, well, hearing an empty space is almost the same as, well, it's functionally equivalent to hearing nothing from a semantic point of view. So I don't think that should be allowed. So Sean shouldn't be able to shout an empty space. And as a necessary corollary to that, Lucy shouldn't hear anything at all. Well, said the tester, but now that doesn't match the rule that this example is supposed to illustrate. You're right, says the product owner. Let's refine this rule. Shouts should be at least 1 non-white space character long. So now this is a trivial, simplistic example. But these sort of things, as Laurent has already demonstrated with his example from trying to rent a car, happen all the time in production systems that never got found by testers. And the systems that many of you work with are more complicated than this. There are going to be more areas for people to have misunderstandings and ambiguities. We work across the globe. We have, in different states, you have different laws, you have different bank holidays, you have different daylight savings time. Perhaps you have multiple different formats for account numbers. There's all sorts of places where you may assume that something is obvious and other people may know different. And this is a forum where you can iron this out immediately, in real time, speaking with your colleagues. Now, here we have a very simplistic example. Another developer then chips up and says, should leading and trailing white space then be trimmed? If we're going to disallow a space on its own, should we chomp and trim any strings that Sean is trying to shout? The product owner goes, I really don't know. I'm going to have to go and speak to the actual customers about that. So they write it on a red card. They allocate ownership of the red card to the product owner, and the product owner commits to trying to get a definitive answer as soon as possible so that you can move on with this story. And there you are. That's example mapping in a nutshell. Not only is this a very simplistic example, but I know that it seemed like it's very simple to do. However, having trained many dozens of teams with example mapping, I can tell you that as soon as you get into your own work, it's very easy to go down rabbit holes. So at the end of the session or later on in the session, I have some some messages that I hope you will take on board. So now we've got we've got an example map that has been approved by the team. They believe they have no more questions. They've got a concrete example. They've got a rule. And now we want to capture it in business readable format. So on the left here, you see the rule card and an example card from the previous slide. And on the right, you see those transposed into Gherkin, which is the semi-structured language that Cucumber and other tools of that nature understand. The words that are on the left-hand side of the page of the feature file, which are in blue, if you could see it on your screen, these are keywords. Here we see 6 keywords: feature, rule, scenario, given, when, then. There are about another 6 keywords in the Gherkin language, so it's not a big language, but essentially the sort of unit that these tools work on are called feature files, that are plain text files. Each feature file starts with the feature keyword, where we can give the feature a name, a descriptive name, so that it's more easy to understand what behaviors are going to be described in that feature file. There will then be at least one rule. That's not strictly true, but once we get down into the weeds, that's out of the scope of the ABC. So there'll be one or more rules that are described within this feature file that correspond to the blue cards that we saw in the example mapping session. And these rules will then be illustrated by one or more scenarios. Here I'm just got a single scenario because, again, it's just a simple example. So the rule that we're illustrating in this feature file is shouts should be at least one non-white space character long. You'll see that it's just the text from the blue card transposed directly into the feature file. And then the scenario is pretty much just a transposition of the text on the example card. In modern versions of Gherkin, you could use the word example interchangeably with scenario here. Then it's followed by a descriptive name, which describes what behavior is being illustrated in the subsequent steps. So the given, when, then lines are steps in the scenario. And that's steps in how the behavior goes. Given indicates the context. You know, what must have happened before this scenario happens to give the system the right context for it to work. The when statement introduces the action that invokes the behavior that we are expecting. And the then statement checks the outcome is as expected. So essentially, given is a setup, when is an action, and then is checking the outcome. In the book that I wrote with Gaspar called Formulation, we introduced an acronym called BRIEF, which I'm immensely proud of. It's a 5-letter acronym that I came up with myself one afternoon on the back of an envelope. And like all good acronyms, not only do the 5 letters mean something useful, but then altogether they also mean something useful. Although it is in the book, as I said, you can get the full blog post is still on the cucumber.io website. What this acronym is saying is that the terminology of your scenario should be drawn from the business domain. Remember, we're trying to aid collaboration, so we don't want to be putting in there technical jargon that won't be intelligible to the consumers, the readers of this specification. We want to use real data. It's got to be concrete for clarity. You know, you saw in the example I just gave, we had an exclamation mark and then we had a white space character. If we had written Sean enters 1 character, well, then it wouldn't have revealed the problem around white space and non-white space. So concrete data is really important. We want to reveal the intent of the behavior, you know, what is the customer trying to achieve, not how they go about achieving it. So in the previous example, we talked about Sean shouting. Well, one potential way that Sean might shout is by pressing a shout button on the UI. And many people will be tempted to write when Sean clicks the shout button. We don't want to do that because that's not Sean's intent. His intent is not to click a button. His intent is to send a message out. And yes, he might do it by clicking a shout button, or he might do it by hitting return or using the tab key, or maybe he might do it by winking at his AI camera, which knows that that means he's going to shout something out. I don't know. But we don't want to put mechanics in there when what we're trying to illustrate has nothing to do with those mechanics themselves. It's also true to say that almost every system that we use has a huge amount of context, right? So putting in an exclamation mark probably isn't all the context there is. Sean will probably have had to start up the application. He might have had to log on. Perhaps there would be two-factor authentication. Maybe he would have to accept the terms and conditions. All of these things may be prerequisites for him shouting, but these are not important, essential details to put in a scenario that is simply illustrating that one character is allowed and no characters is not allowed. Therefore, we omit those setup details from the scenario. The automation code will have to handle that, but we don't want to communicate and clutter up a scenario because that will get in the way of the basic necessity of having a high bandwidth, clear communication. When you have dozens of setup context actions, it becomes very hard to see what's important, and you will quickly lose the interest of your product owners and business analysts. Also, scenarios should be brief, be focused, I'm sorry. They should illustrate a single rule, not multiple rules. So if you remember from the example map that I showed you a few slides ago, the green example cards were lined up underneath blue rule cards. Each example should attempt to illustrate a single rule. If you find you've got an example that illustrates multiple rules, try and tease it apart. Again, make some of it implicit for one example and something else implicit for another example. And finally, I would love your scenarios to be short. We work to a heuristic of fewer than 6 steps. So 6 given, when, then steps. This is not common in the internet. And a lot of people will say it's not possible. It's always possible. Always. And then finally, automation. So this is the fact that Cucumber has got a bigger square and applications got a tiny circle is not supposed to in any way make you think that Cucumber is bigger than applications or more important. It's just I've got more to put in it. So there's a domain of specification, automated document checking that Cucumber and its associated tools such as SpecFlow, Rec and Roll, Bhat, etc. live in. And your application is not in that domain. So Cucumber needs to talk to your application, but your application is not in the Cucumber domain and doesn't need to know anything about Cucumber or other tools. As I said before, Cucumber works on the unit of a feature file. And each feature file, as I said, was a text file, and it contains scenarios. Each scenario is made up of one or more steps, those the given, when, then, and lines that we looked at, and they conform to the Gherkin syntax. Every time Cucumber finds a step, it then has to decide what to do with it. And it looks for step definitions. This is code that glues your specification, your feature files, to your application. So Cucumber finds a step, it looks for a matching step definition, And different implementations do that differently, but basically it's a textual match. If it says Sean types in an exclamation mark, there'll be a step definition that matches Sean types as an exclamation mark. And then it calls application code. It can call application code in any way that you like. So it can do it through a tool that just issues UI calls to a web page. It can do it through calls to a web endpoint. It can do it through calls directly to a class or a module in your application. Cucumber doesn't care how you do it. It's code that you write in the step definitions that calls your application. And you can, like I said, you can make direct calls to actual lines of C# code, or you can do database queries, or you can ingest spreadsheets. As long as you find a library that you can use in your step definitions to do that, it is all good. And those step definitions can be written in pretty much whatever language you're working in. Cucumber itself supports Java, JavaScript, Ruby, and to some extent C++. C# was supported by SpecFlow and is now supported by Wreck and Roll, and other languages have other tools that support.
So quick time check, Seb, we have, let's say 10 minutes left if we want to keep a few minutes for the questions.
Okay, I'll power through that one then. So that's the ABC. And I think of, although as BDD, I think of analysis being the same as discovery, business readable as formulation, and automation as continuous delivery.
So we have now a quick poll before we talk about AI and how AI can help you with this. Which flavor of BDD do you use? And now, Arnaud, I think you'll be happy because there is the said flavor of BDD.
And while they're typing, Arnaud, I agree with you. Yes. User stories are not. Yes. I'm trying to look at two things at once, but acceptance criteria are not the scenarios. Rules are the acceptance criteria. So we think of a rule being synonymous with business requirement and acceptance criteria.
So it's interesting, Seb, and that I think that match pretty well what we've seen on the market. So they are, there is a bit more than a third now, 40% of the audience, maybe that is more mature or aware of BDD, that use the three practices. Mm-hmm. Then we have a bit more than 25%, so 1 in 4 that use them for manual tests, given when then. And at SmartBear, we can say we've seen that a lot. a lot. There was no discovery, no automation. And for the rest, a few doing automation only or discovery only.
Okay, thank you. So which leads me to this one. So just doing discovery, I think that's probably, if you're going to do a part of BDD, this is the way to go. It's mandatory. If you don't do discovery, you're not doing BDD. You need to POBA, but there's huge value. If you do discovery and formulation, I see this as a stepping stone to full BDD, but you don't end up with living documentation because you've got no automation to ensure that your documentation stays up to date. You do all three. This is full BDD. Those of you that are doing it already will know the benefits. Those of you that aspire to it, you have my support. If you're just doing formulation, well, then I guess in a way it's the manual testing that Lauren was just talking about. But the other thing to point out is that just because a framework uses the terms given when then, it's got nothing to do with BDD. So there's lots of frameworks that claim to do BDD security or whatever. This is not BDD. Given when then they're just 3 words. And then finally, it's really, really common to find test teams just using Cucumber or tools like that to write automated tests. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but you're just giving yourself an extra piece of work because you've got to write the text and then write the step definitions, and it's not being used to help further collaboration. So it feels like an extra piece of work to me. So can AI help with BDD? This is a great quote from Glenford Myers that I took from a Steve McConnell book. We tried to solve the problem by rushing through the design process so that enough time is left at the end of the project to uncover the errors that were made because we rushed through the design process. Does that sound familiar? Sounds a lot of familiar to me. And of course, because we are where we are in the world at the moment, AI and ML are now the shining armor, the knight in shining armor sitting on the horse coming to save the day. I think of the AI as being the knight in shining armor, and the horse being machine learning. So, machine learning is really what powers the horse, the AI. And, it's worth remembering that AI, certainly when I started learning about AI was this. It was general intelligence. It was, we were going to have commanded data. We were going to have intelligent agents that could handle pretty much anything. I think more of what we have these days is weak or narrow AI. It's programs that are designed to solve, well, it says here exactly one problem, at least a limited problem. And so we haven't got strong AI, we have focused AI. And focused AI basically takes training data and ingests it to try and learn, right? It's not got, although it's called AI, it's not intelligent in the sense that I understand it. It's not coming up with innovative new ideas, except where potentially it can mix and match things that it thinks look similar, and quite often that ends in pain. So I would like to refer you to this wonderful article, which I think you should read, by Leslie Brooks, which is called Never Google a BDD Tutorial. Basically, he said, pretty much every example that he finds on the internet is awful, because all of the things that we just looked at in the previous slide where people are doing things poorly, all of the heuristics that I described in the brief acronym, they don't do that. They basically, all the tutorials are showing Gherkin as a test automation tool. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but most of them. So we have problems to start with, because to get AI working well in this space, we need to have good training data. And yet most of the data that's easily accessible is questionable in value. So let's think about where AI might apply. In discovery, we're going to create example maps. We get some visual feedback from that. So if there are no examples, then it's not ready for development. If there are examples that don't apply to a rule, well, then we're missing a rule. There's some requirement that we need to identify. If we have lots of questions, well, we're not ready to start. If we've got too many rules, it's probable that the story is too big. And for me, that means that the story cannot be delivered from ready to done in less than 3 days. But if we have a few rules, each of them with several examples, well, potentially it's ready. So at this point, this visual feedback, that can be, AI can work on that. It can give us, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. It can give us a good feedback on whether an example map is potentially ready to go through to development. Lessons that I've learned over the year, I'm not going to dwell on these, but like keeping example mapping short, scheduling daily example maps so that you can do away with sprint planning, for instance, making sure that unanswered questions have owners, ensuring that an email goes out at least the day before so that people are ready to prepare for tomorrow's example mapping session, identifying which members of the team really need to come to the session. Does it have to be everybody? Making sure that you've got someone from business, someone from dev, someone test. All of these things could be wired into an AI engine so it can remind you, no, you overran that example mapping session, or you haven't had an example mapping session for 3 days. What's wrong? So there are things that I can see that the AI or AI systems are suitable for helping with. I think that there are areas where AI has a lot of potential in the discovery space. However, I think it's least applicable of the places that I think AI is most likely to deliver value. I think I'm going to show you that formulation and automation has got more value. Here, these are all suggesting, they're trying to identify gaps and warning when practices aren't being followed. But the real issue in discovery is that we are trying to communicate between human beings. We've got one set of people who think they know what they want, but aren't very good at, or might not be very good at expressing it. And the other side, we've got people who are very good at developing, but might not be completely on the ball on the business side of things. And we need to make sure that they communicate to get that answer. AI at best, I think, is going to prod you to ask the question, or prod you to sort of clarify your thinking. I don't believe it's going to be coming up with end user solutions. However, formulation, so if we think about a different domain, you're reserving a library book, and here we've got the idea that library members pay a reservation charge of £1 if they want to, per book that they want to reserve. So if the library has the book, but it's not currently on the shelf, someone else currently has it out on loan, you have to pay £1 to reserve it. And what we need to think about is what the shape of an example is. Every example in the world, not just BDD examples, are made up of a context, an action, and an outcome. When you give your children an example about crossing the road safely, that will have a context, an action, and an outcome. And in this particular case, we're talking about, I'm going to use the Andrew reserves a book, he's charged £1 as the sample that we're going to look at. And the action is clearly Andrew reserving one book. And the outcome is that Andrew should be charged £1. There's no context here. Maybe there's no context that needs to be expressed. Maybe there's no essential context. But if we look up just a little bit higher at the rule that this example is illustrating, well, it's got to be a library member. So we've got that Andrew needs to be a library member. And these are the sort of things that AI could potentially do. They can identify these statements in an example and convert them to some extent into a formulated scenario. So, for instance, we could imagine that AI might look at that and be able to generate that code directly. And what makes it somewhat more compelling is that you may have captured the example in a different format. So, for instance, we used to capture it in tabular format on index cards. We've also used Miro and other tools to capture it using little symbols to identify the context, the action, and the outcome. I'm sure that AI systems could be designed to utilize that. So AI-assisted formulation, I think we could feed it the brief heuristics that I described earlier, and it could spot when, or at least suggest that you're missing a point about there. It can highlight common Gherkin anti-patterns, like having a given statement with 27 ands after it. It can extract and convert examples, and I think it could detect repetitions and duplicates when you come to doing formulation, because it's quite often possible to say the same thing in different ways, and that then makes it confusing for people reading the documentation. So these are areas where I believe formulation could be assisted by AI systems. When it comes to automation, I think there's lots of possibilities here. There's probably a pre-existing relevant automation code in your code base. So I think that AI would be able to pull that out and suggest that you use this when it comes to implementing a step definition. It could potentially suggest new automation code. To do that, however, I think it would be useful to have a catalog of BDD automation patterns, which currently it doesn't exist. And again, we can identify and remove duplicate automation code, because quite often you see that creeping into larger BDD code bases. Spoiler alert, Gashper and I are working on a third book of the BDD book series. called Automation, a Catalogue of BDD Automation Patterns. However, it won't be this year, and it probably won't be next year. So BDD, I think, when implemented the full BDD, you get really good benefits. You'll get early learning just from doing discovery and shared understanding just from doing discovery. By having some automation, you will get much faster feedback. You'll get living documentation. And all in all, I've seen systems that are better quality and far, far lower costs, even though you're investing more upfront. What BDD isn't, it's not a formula based upon given, when, then. It's not about automated testing. It doesn't replace TDD. It works with BDD, and it cannot be implemented by AI on its own without significant human input. Final wrap up. BDD is a set of collaborative and technical practices that support successful agile development. And I'm afraid, Laurent, I've just got my 2 plugs to do. Agile 2024 is happening in Manchester later this month. It's going to be great. I'd love to see you there. Please come along. And secondly, Socrates UK, which is an unconference for software crafters and testers, takes place in Oxford in the UK, September the 19th to 22nd. We've got a training day on Thursday the 19th with brilliant people, Claire Sudbury, Jason Gorman, Tim Ottinger, blah, blah, blah. Really cheap as well. Please come along. Thank you very much.
I know these 2 conferences, so I definitely recommend to our audience. One of the key takeaways, something that really came up as you were presenting, Seb, is when we look at the data today around BDD or examples of Gherkin scenarios, the quality is really, really low, which kind of matches our common experience. And relying on just AI without strong guidance there can be a real issue. I mean, we've seen today data from almost all organizations using Copilot that shows an increase in velocity, but also increase in technical debt. So I think that could probably be worse in the BDD space because of the bad examples, a lot of bad examples that exist. So I think you third book will be really welcome. And that's typically where also, just to close the loop on PackMind, a solution like PackMind can help, because as you define these good patterns, that will really ensure that all developers, as they code in the ID, but also if you use Copilot, help Copilot generate the code following you practices and guidance. So I think we need your book quickly.
I'm sorry, that's not going to happen.
Excellent. So do we have any questions for audience? We have 5 minutes left. I can see Arno is typing. Yeah, so no pressure on the third book, Seb.
No, honestly, I don't feel the pressure because there's just nothing I can do to make it go any faster.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So two questions for you, Seb. How can the audience be useful to you? And the second one, but I think that's what you've written here. If people want to reach out, what's the best way to do it?
Yep. So the best way to do it is email, basically. I'm also on LinkedIn, so please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not difficult to find there either. And I do check email and LinkedIn on a regular basis. Twitter less so, but yeah, Mastodon is a way to ping me quite quickly. When it comes to making use of the audience, well, I'm not sure there's anything particularly I've got to say there. We are always looking for more contributors in the Cucumber community. Although Gaspar has actually got a lot of support in the SpecFlow, in the Rec and Roll community now, I'm sure that he wouldn't be averse to it either. I think the Python community and PHP communities are both also looking. So basically, it's an open source problem. We've got lots of, if there are people here from companies that rely on one of these tools, I strongly urge you to ask your company to donate money to those open source projects. There's the whole software engineering world is built upon people that do open source software for nothing. And that hasn't scaled, and it will remain a bad way of maintaining critical software going into the future. So yeah, give money, give time, and spread the word. I mean, obviously you can go and buy my books. I wouldn't mind that either.
Thank you for sharing that. And I mean, definitely when I see the success of these open source, I think last time we checked, the number of Cucumber downloads were well over 80 million, if I remember correctly. So we'll soon pass the 100 million downloads mark. It's pretty impressive. So it needs a strong community. That's a good point. All right. Well, if there is no more questions, thank you very much, folks. This webinar was recorded, so it will be available in our YouTube channel. Thank you for the time again. And if you have any question related to BDD, you know where to reach out to Seb. So
yes,
please do. Thank you, folks. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.